these are, lightning talks are kind of fun because they're a chance to go through and do some stuff. So tonight I just decided to pull together a little bit of code that I once wrote and continue to use to help myself out with my dual passions of drinking and having a drink. And I'm going to kind of go through some of that tonight in terms of what we do. So let me talk a little bit about that because it's kind of fun, at least in the short term for me. So in addition to doing technology, I like wine, like a whole lot, and like a whole lot. So I drink a lot of it, but I also study it. So I've actually I did the certificate program at UC Davis in viticulture and enology, and I'm a student in what's called a diploma program out of the WSET London, which is a wine and spirits education trust. So I get a lot of tests, and I study a lot about wine and alcohol, and I have one coming up. In fact, that's one of the reasons I'm flying out. In addition to seeing a client, is I have to go take a test. I'm also busy because people like Joe call me the night before and ask me to do presentations. So I find myself needing.
How that conversation went, by the way.
It is in my head. Plus, I would like to point out that it sounds absolutely crazy if I say I volunteered to Joe to do a presentation the night before I had to go out. But if I make it sound like Joe really needed somebody to do a presentation, then it totally absolves me of guilt, makes me look like a great person, and I'm here.
I'm with you.
All right. It's all about changing the story, just a little. All right, so I'm always looking for an opportunity to study and to find time to do things. And so I literally do have flashcards among many, many other things that I do. In fact, I've got tens of thousands of flashcards that I'm constantly going through in efforts to kind of learn these things. And Quizlet's one of the places that I do flashcards. And that's great, and it's very helpful. But it turns out that they get quite upset with you if you're attempting to drive and read flashcards at the same time. Don't know why, but it happens. So I thought it would be a pretty cool idea to use some of the technologies that we have together to turn these into more of an interactive audio experience. So we're going to play a little bit with some of the code I did to do that tonight. And in the process, we'll talk a little bit about some of the services that are out there and maybe some of where I'm going to take this project next. So first and foremost, let's talk about this, which is Amazon Polly. Has anyone ever played with Polly? No? Cool. Then that works even better. So Polly, assuming I can manage to make the Amazon app come up there.
Spell Polly.
Well, look, man, there's only so many things you can do. And apparently this isn't one of them. All right, so Polly is a text-to-speech engine, okay, that Amazon produces. And we're not talking my old school Commodore 64 speech engine. It does a little bit more than that. In fact, not only does it do text translation, it can do massive amounts and really quickly and really pretty inexpensively in text-to-speech. It supports multiple voices, dialects, it supports multiple languages, and it supports the ability to customize them. So when we do something in Polly, we can try and do basic things.
Hi, my name is Joanna. I will read any text you type here.
Joanna's saucy. But it's a pretty cool text engine, and it's pretty cool what it can do because it attempts to mimic relatively natural speech. It understands things like pauses, like the fact that we take pauses in the course of conversation. And it doesn't try to necessarily pronounce everything in its native language. In fact, actually, I think one of the more fascinating things they did is that when it comes across a French word, depending on how you configure it, it either tries to pronounce it like an English speaker attempting to pronounce French, or if you tell it, it'll actually pronounce it correctly in French. So it's pretty neat the things that you can actually do with it. It's configurable through tons of languages and regions that we can do. Yeah, the Welsh one's fun. And when you get a little more specific, or if you want to kind of get into it, you can customize lexicons and produce your own pronunciations for anything that you have. But more basically, if we didn't want to kind of get into that part, we can actually use something called SSML. And SSML is basically a markup language that is a little bit more advanced than just the text presentation that we used to begin with. The markup language allows us to take the ability and really customize word per word, if we want to, down to the way in which we can present and talk the text.
What's the SS?
It's
Synthesized speech.
with you.
Yeah, okay.
All right. I'm hoping you're right. I don't know. Yeah, no, I did. So we can actually work with this. Now, the little console thing that we're doing here will take up to 100,000 characters, which is, or 10,000, or yeah, 100,000 characters, which is a little silly. But as you all probably know, Amazon has a pretty rich API. So we can pump lots and lots of things through this API and just get charged the CPU time, which is incredibly low for what we actually want to do. So we can work through different voices, we can work through different pronunciations, we can even get down to the point of configuring how long the individual voice pauses between words when they're speaking, which can be an interesting trick when you're doing some of these things. I personally play around with the idea of having different voices because when I'm listening to things and they become monotonous, I sort of zone out. So sometimes I'll actually play with different voices and different patterns of speech and things to kind of keep me interested as I'm listening. So I thought Polly was pretty cool. And Polly is one of a number of really amazing tools. On this side of it, it's in synthesizing text to speech. But then Amazon Comprehend, which is a language classifier, a natural language classifier, can actually do things like extract information. So these two are kind of interesting to me. So I thought, if I took the Quizlet API and took all of my flashcards that I keep going through over and over and over again, and I married it up with Amazon Polly, I could have a really cool sort of interactive quiz show that was always going on in my car. And I do. So let's talk about how that actually works. So we're going to bounce back to a little bit of Node.js code at the moment, and we'll go to this one to start with. Go that up a little bit.
Do you want to turn the lights off?
Yeah, sorry. All right, so there's a couple tools that are in play here that we're going to talk about. First of all, we're using Amazon Polly, and Amazon Polly has the ability to generate MP3s for speech. We're also using a tool called FFmpeg that any of you that have been around entirely too long might know what that is. But it's an old open source tool that has been continued to be evolved over the years, but it's honestly
Very useful.
what was it?
Still very
Still
useful.
incredibly useful tool to be able to do basically any sort of manipulation. So I'm using a combination from Node of FFmpeg, and I'm using Amazon services. So let's just play around a little bit with some of what I have going on. Just to start with, to begin with, I'm kind of throwing in some secret access keys, so I guess I'll be changing that after this presentation goes online. And then we, yeah, well, free CPU.
I can blur it out.
Okay, I'll do free CPU time for a couple hours. And I'm declaring, in this case, AWS Polly, where I'm going to actually, what region I'm going to run in. So in this case, it's US East, which is one of the cheaper engines if you know from Amazon land, mostly because most of the electricity is coal, so it's cheaper there. But it's true statement. All right, but I'm going to do a couple things. Now, right now, instead of hitting that API directly, I just saved off my cards here as a text file. And I did that mainly because I didn't want to wait. Their API is a little sluggish sometimes, so it's in here somewhere if we want to see what it is. There's a lot, as you can tell, of different ones that I do, and there it is. Whew. All right. So these are those same sorts of cards we just saw. I just basically brought them down into a sort of CSV-ish format that could be exported in the short term. It's very similar to what I actually get out of their API from calling directly. So I read that file, and I'm going to do a little work on it. And so that work is going to be in this big old RX composition I have over here called 2 flashcards. So what 2 flashcards is going to do, we'll start down here at the bottom, is we're going to set up a little bit of our synthesized speech, which is an API call to Amazon. And we're going to parse our data input. So we just have a little parser. It's nothing particularly special, just a little bit of functional code that goes out, splits up the CSV, reduces it down into a couple things, and does this cool thing, which is that we create something called a speak node, and we XML escape it. Now that's because of the fact that I really like the way that Amazon does this, but I still actually want to customize the speech a little bit. Because over time I get really frustrated that words are mispronounced and difficult. So over time I've also been building a list of all the different wine-related words that I want to make sure are pronounced in very specific ways that I've included in here, such that at any speech node that I actually create, I can actually, that's just funny for me. I have notes to myself even in my own tools. So I go through and I can actually build with the words that it knows about a language markup map for all the different regions. So as it's parsing my cards, it looks for any of the matched markup words and it marks them up using the SSML so that it knows how to pronounce those words more appropriately. Okay? Sir?
Which API is giving you that substitution ability? Is
This
it part
is-
of Polly?
It is part of Polly.
Okay.
Okay? So well, I'm doing the substitution, but what I'm actually doing here is I'm pumping it in using their SSML, which allows me to wrap a
So you
node
wrap it
and
around.
say, oh, this particular node is in Spanish, or this particular node's in whatever locale I'd like. Okay? End of the day, though, what I'm really doing is a little bit of regexing, and I'm building out a little bit of a language string, which pretty much goes through and replaces everything. Okay? So it builds out a string into a given language, knits them all together. So coming out of here, what I've done is I've boiled down that whole series of markup into some speak nodes, one for a question, one for an answer, okay? For each one of those. So that's what my parser did. Now, after we go onto there, I do a little bit of work because I'm lazy, and I locally cache things through their MD5 hash so I don't have to regenerate them if I don't want to again. So I do a little bit of work to see if I have existing. That's not an important part, that's an optimization. But I basically go through and make these little hashes, and then I figure out what needs to be added, what needs to be removed. And then I do the cool part, which is building this MP3 composition. So how that actually works is that it takes each one of those speech nodes that I just created, and it basically creates one for SSML and my lexicons that I set up, and says, I'd like to actually have the question part in Amy's voice, and then I'd like to have the answer part in Brian's voice. And I'm going to build those two back up, and then using RX, I'm just basically building a concatenation of taking each one of those and calling it through the API asynchronously, bringing them back down. And from that, I can then go in and take those big concatenations and eventually go through, and I'll do some error catching, that's okay, and eventually go through and take those together, and using FFmpeg, I can build out some chunks. Now I do some other little things along the way, shuffle them up, so if I run it a couple times in a row, I don't get them in the same order, do different things. But FFmpeg, which is really good at being able to stitch together MP3s, well, I take all of these great little snippets I've taken of all these questions and all these answers, and I stitch them together into a long series of MP3s that I can just put on if I want to, and listen in the background as I'm going along and running things. So it gets pretty neat, and if you want to see how it works out here, is I'll go back here and we'll run it real quick.
So it's still a series of MP3s. You haven't taken the MP3s and stuffed them all into one MP3.
Right, that's what's happening right here, which is the little, if we see it, the transcoding succeeded, it's successful, it stitched them together, okay? So what I end up getting here is something that's kind of like this. Well, I suppose it's something that's exactly like this. Do.
Are cooperatives permitted to sell their own wine?
Of course,
A shipper's own vineyards.
and so on and so forth.
Which port grape is prone to fungal diseases due to its tight bunches but can produce full-bodied wines with concentrated black fruits and spicy notes that are approachable in youth, but are also capable of aging?
The answer is Tinta Amarella. All right, cool. So that's the type of
Tinta
thing
Amarella.
that I stitched together. Now, that was neat, and it worked out pretty well for me, and I was able to do a lot of things. But I also listened to a lot of audiobooks.
10 minutes.
Yeah, it's all good. I'm almost done. Fine. So,
I just never know when he's getting close to the end.
so I also thought that that was interesting, and I quite like some of what it can do because I can build these big long MP3s of arbitrary length, right? Because although Amazon will constrain the length, using FFmpeg, I can sort of stitch things back together on the back end and pull them together in any way I want to. But it turns out I can do a couple of other fun things that go along with it. Number one, I like audiobooks, but a lot of the things I'm reading aren't available as audiobooks. But if you can get them as a PDF, then you could parse that text out of that PDF, and perhaps you could do a little regexing on the parsed text to figure out where chapters begin, and go ahead and build it up, such that
How much did this book cost you in
$1.85
There you
in
go.
Amazon processing time. So I can go in and say, thank you very much.
Introduction. The foundation of this book is the lecture on viticulture that, since 1986, I have given, and continue to give, to diploma students at the Wine and Spirit Education Trust, WSET, in London and other parts of the UK and Ireland.
It's a crap British accent.
I was actually almost going to change it because of the fact that I knew you were going to say that. However, so that gets kind of fun, right? So now I can make my own audiobooks, whenever I want to, and change up those things. And if you noticed the pausing and the little bit of pieces in there, it's because in some of the drier text, I find, and this is a speaker trick as well, that sometimes if you slow things down, people pay more attention. I do the same thing with my audiobooks. I go ahead and I actually introduce longer pauses so that I don't zone out and pay a little bit more attention to them. I can actually, in fact, with Amazon, you can vary randomly the pauses so that they sound a little bit more fluid and a little more actual to how someone would speak instead of a very regimented speaking tone. You can actually sort of have those natural pauses, and all of that comes at the expense of literally just coming through here. And let me find the note in here somewhere for you. Whatever. I can't find it. That's fine. But you can get it literally by just indicating that, oh, there it is, that I want to use auto breaths, that I want to put breaths at natural places and breaks within the piece. Now that sounds interesting, and I like that, and it's pretty cool. And that brings me to what I started doing after that, which I will admit is not entirely complete yet, mostly because of the fact that it produces a lot of nonsense sometimes. But what I can do as well is that I can go back and I can look at things like Amazon Comprehend. Does anyone know what Comprehend is?
You mentioned it earlier.
You speak, it puts text.
Yeah, that's a very good sort of overview. Yeah, it's not actually at all, but that's okay. So
That's what I said, natural language processing.
yes. So Amazon Comprehend will analyze sentences for you and give you information, like what it feels about those. For instance, Amazon's an organization and there's a location, Seattle, and there was a date and a person and some other information. So then I thought, well, what would be really interesting is that instead of just writing the flashcards myself and having it read them back to me, if I already have it reading my book, why shouldn't I have it read my book and try and make flashcards for me real time?
You could sell this to high schoolers.
Now,
This is Cliff Notes on steroids.
to be fair, this one's still a work in
I'll
progress.
say on Molly.
This one's a work in progress and a little dicey still, because the problem is that it'll say things like, you know, the next section will be covered rapidly, and the flashcard will come back and be like, what's going to be covered rapidly? So, it's not by any means a perfect environment yet, but you can draw really interesting things out of this information, and stitching them together with Polly and these different pieces, you can produce some really rich flashcards and some really rich interactive things. So some of my next pieces that I'm playing with this are not only to do this, because all this will work offline now, right? But is the ability to actually do an interactive sort of online thing, Alexa style, where we can actually play quiz show throughout the course of a day as I'm walking around the house. So, how's that as a starting point? Questions?
Does it help to smoke weed?
Yes.
Do you ever relax?
This is very relaxing. So right now I have transcribed, and actually it's kind of fun. In my various output folder here, you'll see the transcriptions of the various books and all the flashcards that I've made.
Why do you care about wine?
So far. It unites my two passions of drinking and having a drink. Yeah.
Drinking and filling glasses.
Yeah.
It's awesome.
So I've got about 47,000 flashcards in here now at this rate, along with all my books and chapters, thanks to Amazon, for a sum total of $11 of CPU time.
Wait a second, but do they actually help you pick the flashcards that's gonna help you memorize all the other flashcards?
Yeah, once I can query real time from my brain, it'll be much more successful. But in the short term, it's kind of a fun piece to show just a little bit of the power of pulling together a couple of different APIs that are available for a very small amount of CPU time and for a small amount of code. I mean, honestly, it's 200 lines of code that does everything that we saw so far and kind of pulls it together. I think that's kind of fun.